The situation in Iran remains complex and uncertain, yet the United States' decision not to intervene during the height of the protests carries significant implications for European security. Today, I want to clarify why the U.S. chose to stay out of Iran, at least for now. There are both harsh criticisms and valid critiques of the Trump administration's handling of the situation, some directed at their choice to refrain from intervention, others aimed at earlier strategic decisions that shaped this moment. After exploring these angles, we will turn our attention back to Europe's future security landscape. First, let me provide a summary of the current state of affairs. It is important to emphasize that it is far too soon to draw any firm conclusions about the ultimate outcome of the unrest in Iran. About a week ago, reports indicated that the wave of protests was diminishing. Our best assessment is that the peak of the protests has passed, though a resurgence remains possible. The only remaining factor worth monitoring closely is the organized resistance from Kurdish groups, but beyond that, there is little sign of widespread unrest. Our understanding of the situation is complicated by Iran's internet shutdown, which began on January 8th. This blackout was clearly designed to disrupt protesters' ability to coordinate and to prevent international observers from witnessing any government atrocities. In other words, it is entirely possible that conditions remain dire but remain hidden from view. However, this does not seem to reflect the prevailing international consensus. It is also notable that the internet blackout remains in effect. If the Iranian government genuinely believed the threat had passed, restoring online access would be a logical move to signal normalcy. Beyond the immediate ebb and flow of protests, Iran has taken no steps to address the root causes that sparked the unrest: rampant inflation, severe water shortages, and inadequate electricity production. In fact, the protests have arguably exacerbated these problems rather than alleviating them. Some have suggested that ignoring these grievances guarantees a repeat of protests in the future. Unfortunately, the dynamics of autocratic regimes are more complicated. Such governments often persist despite widespread public dissatisfaction because citizens are too fearful to resist openly. Coordinated protests require what can only be called a rare form of collective magic, a fragile alignment of courage, opportunity, and communication. There is no guarantee that this alignment will recur anytime soon. Keep this in mind as we analyze the Trump administration's response. With that background, let's address the common criticisms of the Trump administration's handling of the protests in Iran. Given the protests' apparent decline and the absence of American intervention, many have accused President Trump of backing down, of issuing threats he never followed through on, resulting in policy failure. If you have followed my coverage of the Iran protests, you probably anticipate my perspective on this. The same theme surfaced recently with the Greenland controversy. Trump's reputation for chickening out largely stems from his tariff policies. He often backs down on tariffs because they cause mutual economic harm, and everyone understands they lack the real leverage to compel compliance. However, Trump's military threats operate differently. The United States retains the capability to inflict disproportionate damage through kinetic action. This explains operations like the strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, bombing runs on Iran's nuclear facilities, and the Special Forces operation in Venezuela targeting Maduro, all conducted in President Trump's first year. Few recent presidents have launched as many bold military actions so early in their terms. In Iran's case, however, a meaningful intervention was simply not feasible. Protests erupted across the entire country, meaning any military action would have required numerous precise strikes against small, dispersed targets. Furthermore, the U.S. naval assets necessary for such an operation were not present in the region. The most concrete military option offered to President Trump was deploying the destroyer USS Roosevelt, a valuable asset, but certainly insufficient to conduct miracles alone. For those quick to accuse Trump of backing down, part of the public disappointment may come from conflating this case with the failed attempt to overthrow Maduro in Caracas. Extrapolating from Venezuela makes it seem as if the U.S. can extract foreign leaders on a whim whenever directed by the president. That simplistic view ignores the months of painstaking intelligence preparation behind such operations. The United States may have the most powerful military in the world, but raw force is most effective when combined with a carefully crafted strategy. Even the protests in Iran, while creating new opportunities, did not suddenly enable U.S. special forces to arrest Iran's supreme leader Khamenei. Regional U.S. allies shared this view and advocated for restraint. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and Israel, all eager to see Iran weakened, believed that half measures would be worse than no measures at all. They feared that provoking the Ayatollah without capturing him could unleash a cascade of destabilizing consequences. Israel, in particular, worried about missile attacks from Iran. The Israeli Defense Forces increasingly rely on U.S. military assets to intercept Iranian missile shipments, but those assets were not available at that moment. Another point of criticism directed at Trump concerns his public statements encouraging Iranian protesters by claiming help is on the way. Critics argued this gave protesters false hope, convincing them to continue their demonstrations only to leave them vulnerable when no direct U.S. assistance materialized. While caution is warranted in attributing protester motivations to a single statement, it remains unclear whether a different public framing would have been more effective. The Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was indeed en route to the region, yet because effective protest coordination is so fragile and rare, it was not wise for protesters to disperse only to regroup once the carrier arrived. The only reliable path was for the protests to endure until the carrier's arrival, which may not have been feasible. If another opportunity arises and the Lincoln arrives without any U.S. action, then labeling Trump as having chickened out might be fair, but that moment has not yet arrived. A more substantive critique of the Trump administration is that there was no carrier strike group in the Middle East at the time, which historically had been a constant U.S. presence. Why was the strike group absent? Because the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford had been redeployed to the Caribbean to lead operations related to Venezuela. U.S. strategists had to weigh their options. Keeping the Ford near Iran might influence Iranian politics during domestic instability, if such instability occurred, versus using the carrier to exert pressure on Venezuela's Maduro regime, which offered a more immediate and guaranteed strategic benefit. This photo, not shown, serves as a reminder of the clear impact the U.S. had in Venezuela, at least in the short term. While long-term questions about Venezuela's future remain, the situation is currently as stable as expected, given the circumstances. On the Persian Gulf front, maintaining a carrier presence could have allowed the U.S. to influence Iranian politics during unrest. But such instability is inherently unpredictable. It is possible that CIA resources were stretched thin by focusing so heavily on Venezuela, potentially limiting intelligence capabilities related to Iran. Still, protests are inherently unpredictable and require a degree of magic that no intelligence agency can guarantee. Regardless, decisions must be judged based on the information available at the time. You wouldn't blame someone for betting $100 on black and roulette only because the ball landed on red. You can't know the outcome in advance. The question was whether it was better to secure the certain gains from Venezuela or gamble on the uncertain but potentially massive payoff from Iran. How one feels about this strategic trade-off ultimately depends on one's political priorities. In defense of the Trump administration, Iran has not experienced this degree of instability since the Shah's era. For the past decade, carriers stationed near the Persian Gulf have had little to do. Meanwhile, many in and outside the administration had long sought to remove Maduro after he undermined democratic governance and embedded cartel influence in Venezuela. In criticism, one could argue that Venezuela was merely a pawn in the broader geopolitical struggle against China, while Iran represents a more critical rook on the strategic chessboard. From that perspective, prioritizing the Persian Gulf made more sense. To add context, if the primary concern is China, a key part of any protracted conflict would involve cutting off Beijing's oil supplies. Shutting off Venezuela's oil exports would be relatively straightforward, given its proximity to the U.S., but Iran would require significant naval commitments across two distant theaters, the Persian Gulf and the Taiwan Strait. It looks as though Iran, the rook in this analogy, will remain a significant factor on the board. If you dislike this outcome, the blame should be placed on the Trump administration's overall national security strategy rather than individual tactical decisions. Zooming out, this episode carries a broader lesson for Europe about the limits of American power. Recall that the Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was redeployed to the Persian Gulf from the South China Sea, an area experiencing record incursions by the Chinese People's Liberation Army near Taiwan. Even though the Indo-Pacific region is Washington's main strategic focus outside the Americas, the U.S. still faces difficult choices about resource allocation. In the wake of events like the Greenland gaslighting episode, Europe has grown increasingly skeptical of the Trump administration's commitment. Many European allies now believe Washington will prioritize the Indo-Pacific if Russia and China coordinate their efforts. This perception partly explains why NATO allies agreed last year at the HEG summit to increase core defense spending to 3.5% of GDP, a hopeful sign of follow-through after Greenland. However, some countries remain resistant, with at least one officially rejecting the metric and others harboring political factions lobbying against it. It's important to set aside bad faith actors who support Russia's success and instead focus on those acting in good faith but concerned about the future of transatlantic relations. Although it may seem far-fetched, there will be a post-Trump world, actually only 3 years from tomorrow. Despite current grimness, signs are bright for NATO's future. Public opinion polls in the U.S. show rising support for the alliance. A November 2025 Reagan Foundation survey reported that 68% of respondents held a favorable view of NATO, compared to just 22% unfavorable, a jump from 62% favorable in May 2024, before Trump's return to office. This suggests that Trump's policies on NATO are not popular within the U.S., and no fresh presidential candidate would likely embrace them. Only figures like J.D. Vance might be tied to such policies due to their administration affiliations. In this light, European politicians are discussing hedging their security investments. They understand that Trump-style policies could persist, but they should not plan as though such policies are guaranteed. This measured approach is healthy and should inform decisions about military production and capability development. However, there is a tendency to attribute every decision made during the Trump administration solely to Donald Trump's personal quirks, rather than recognizing the deeper strategic calculations coming from the Pentagon's career officials. For example, would a hypothetical President Rubio impose tariffs on European allies to coerce a Greenland sale? Probably not. Yet Arctic security concerns would remain, as they are driven by enduring Pentagon priorities regardless of the party in power. Similarly, whether the next president is Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, or anyone else, they will confront persistent security challenges in the North. The most prominent example of this continuity is the ongoing tension between European and Indo-Pacific theaters. Past administrations attempted to pivot to Asia, but often failed. The current U.S. administration has successfully made that transition, and a reversion seems unlikely. Despite this Indo-Pacific focus, the U.S. had to withdraw its carrier presence from that region due to limited resources. This reality carries a sobering implication for Europe, which ranks lower in strategic prioritization. Europe cannot count on abundant American military assistance in times of crisis, regardless of who occupies the White House. The silver lining is that this clarity simplifies Europe's investment decisions. It no longer needs to hedge between two divergent futures, one in which Trump's policies persist and another where traditional national security figures regain influence. The continent should invest as if its very survival depends on it, because in a new era defined by shifting power balances, that is precisely the case. European leadership is already adapting. You may have noticed recent shifts in rhetoric, describing China as the primary pacing threat to the Western coalition, rather than Russia. This serves as a warning. The era of unipolar American military dominance was fleeting. Europe must recognize this new reality and arm itself accordingly. The limitations of U.S. military power also have profound consequences for Europe's operational strategies. For example, last month I visited Estonia to observe a NATO cybersecurity exercise. The journey spanned nearly 7,000 kilometers, and although it may have seemed uneventful on the surface, that was precisely the point. The exercise demonstrated NATO's cyber resilience and the challenges Europe faces in defending itself in a digitally contested environment. If the world would only pause for a moment, I would share more about that experience, but 2026 continues to bring new challenges. For now, you can watch my video about the NATO cybersecurity exercise in Estonia, where I traveled thousands of kilometers essentially to witness the invisible. Cyber defense is quiet but critical work. If you found today's discussion insightful, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for future updates. I look forward to seeing you next time.